Hi Krishna, very dear devotees. Welcome back again to our ongoing lecture series on the glories of our beloved Sri Vrindavan Dham. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya, Krishna Pashtaya Bhutale, Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane. Namaste Saraswati Deve, Gauravani Pacharine, Nivishesha Shunyavadi, Paschata Adeshatarane. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. So, after finishing our last series on Lord Nrsingadev in Vrindavan, I was thinking what to speak about next. We've covered a lot of territory as regards Vrindavan in the last 2.5 years. So the other day I decided to take a walk and think about a subject or a series we could speak on. And for inspiration, I actually ended up taking a rickshaw into Vrindavan town, where I started to walk around. And as I did so, I began marveling at the old architecture that still makes up a good portion of what we now call Vrindavan town. You know, the many temples, the shrines, the old homes, the various structures, built hundreds and hundreds of years ago, that one finds in walking through a myriad of streets and old lanes, tiny lanes here and there. And it suddenly dawned on me that this wasn't the Vrindavan that Krishna lived in. That's very clear from his statement to his father in Srimad Bhagavatam 10:24. Krishna says, Nana paro jana pada nagrama nagriya vayam. Vano kashash tata nityam vana shaila nivashina. We quoted that verse many times last year. My dear Father, our home is not in the cities or towns or villages. Being forest dwellers, we always live in the forest and on the hills. So Vrindavan was actually still very much like that 500 years ago. When Lord Chaitanya visited, a forested area. And it remained so, even though the 6 Goswamis came and they built a number of temples in Vrindavan on Mahaprabhu's order. We know about that order. It's in Chaitanya Charitamrita Madhya 132, I believe. It said, after going to Vrindavan, the brothers preached devotional service and discovered many places of pilgrimage. They specifically initiated the service of Madan Mohan and Govindaji, which included building temples. So, factually speaking, it's Krishna's opinion that residence in towns and cities is in the mode of passion. That we find in Srimad Bhagavatam 11:25. Vanam tu satviko vasho gramo raja su uchate tamasam yuta sadanam man niketam tu nirgunam. Quote, residence in the forest is in the mode of goodness. Residence in a town is in the mode of passion. Residence in a gambling house displays the quality of ignorance, but residence in a place where I reside is transcendental. That's from the mouth of Sri Krishna. But although that's the preferred Vrindavan, that's the eternal Vrindavan, the rural Vrindavan, the cows and the pasturing grounds and so forth. That's how you think of Vrindavan when you read Krishna book. But at that moment, that I was walking through Vrindavan, I was looking around and remembering that one time I heard Prabhupada said, in Vrindavan there are thousands of temples. Once he said 5,000 temples. So as I looked around, I was wondering, where did all these old, ornate, beautiful structures come from? I wasn't thinking of the growing metropolis that has sprung up in the last several decades, but this vast array of even small and you could say big royal palaces that we sometimes don't see because now they're very old and gray. Rural Vrindavan, yes, but also Vrindavan Since the time of the Goswamis, it developed over hundreds of years with many palaces, beautiful buildings. So I was wondering, where did all this come from? This is also Vrindavan. It attracts the people to Vrindavan. So I started thinking, what's the history? How did this beautiful town, the residence of the Lord, where because he resides there, it's completely transcendental in its deity form. So I was wondering what to do, how to find out how it all came about. So I went to visit a good friend of mine, a sadhu who's a scholar, one of the mahants, or the main authorities in the Radhaballabha Sampradaya. And I discussed this with him, and he loaned me a book. It's called Vrindavan Dham Anuraga Vali. Vrindavan Dham Anuraga Vali, which translated means the creeper of deep attachment to Sri Vrindavan Dham, which it's a scholarly work. It contains a lot of history, a lot of the history of old Vrindavan. Not so much philosophy, but history. And therein I discovered, somewhat to my surprise, that much of what we know of old Vrindavan, and which still exists, was built by royal families over the centuries. Now, while it's true that Vrindavan is a place of bhajans and bhajananandis, sadhus who come and renunciates deep spiritual seekers who live simple lives in the forests and the hills of Braj, chanting 192 rounds a day, or going on Govardhan Parikrama 3 or 4 times a day. Well, that's true. Vrindavan is also a place, I was reading, where the royal, the wealthy, and the powerful expressed their devotion to Krishna. Because one can also be a king, or a president, or a prime minister, or a head of a business, or an athlete, and be a great devotee. It's a question of the heart, the consciousness, how one is serving Krishna. So I discovered that these royal families, they expressed their devotion in Vrindavan by building temples and shrines for the pleasure of Krishna and the many pastimes he performed there. Srila Sanatana Goswami says in his commentary to Hari Bhakti Vilas 18.7, actually that anyone who builds a temple for the Lord is assured of an elevated destination. Here's the actual verse. Sura Vaishmani Yavhanto Dvi Jendra Para Manava Tavadvarsha Sahasrani Sarvaloki Mahayate. Quote, one who creates a temple for Lord Hari stays in heaven for as many thousands of years as there are atoms in the temple. One who creates a temple for Lord Hari stays in heaven for as many thousands of years as there are atoms in the temple. Of course, our goal is not Shvarga Loka, but Sanatana Goswami is just saying that by that activity one is elevated to a very high position. Building temples, because temples means the Lord's installed in the temple and people come to see the Lord, to have darshan with the Lord. And darshan also means the Lord sees you. He sees into your heart and inspires you what you have to do to become his pure devotee. So I was thinking thus that these kings, these royal personalities, they've actually done immense service to the Lord and derived immense benefit in their own personal lives by all this amazing old construction in Braj. It was done very tastefully. So, with that in mind, I decided to do a short series of lectures about the many devotional families, the kings, the queens, the princes, the princesses, and how they contributed either as a family or many times just individuals in those families came forth and became great devotees. How they contributed to the culture of Braj as it developed down through the centuries. After Lord Chaitanya sent the 6 Goswamis to develop Vrindavan. His purpose, actually Mahaprabhu's purpose, was to make it a very attractive spiritual place. Because, of course there's the beauty and the simplicity of the forest, but Mahaprabhu's movement's for everyone, irregardless. And his idea was to make it, you could say, like a spiritual headquarters, to make it look very beautiful so people would come just to see the beauty of this town and the deity worship and the sadhus speaking the scriptures and visiting the holy places. So it had to develop so the whole world would come here. And what those royal families did is how Vrindavan looks today. Of course, not the big metropolis that's going on, but very tastefully done. And actually, as a result, both for its spiritual renown and for its architecture and beauty and scholarlyship, Vrindavan has become one of India's foremost attractions, both for foreigners and people in this country. The foreigners, they come, in Kartik or, in Gaur Purnim that time, but having lived here almost 3 years now, you would be amazed how many people come from Delhi and come from Agra and Lucknow every weekend. You can't even walk on the streets of Vrindavan on the weekend because so many people come here. When I first came here in 1972, it was a sleepy little village. And there was only one car, I remember. One of the Goswamis had a car, and to make a phone call you had to go to the telephone exchange and wait for 2 or 3 hours to make a call to Delhi. And if I wanted to call home to my mother, I booked the call for 2 days later. But nowadays, because of the preaching of ISKCON under Srila Prabhupada's desire, Vrindavan's become very, very famous. But we should know for sure that the original simple Vrindavan that Krishna described in the verse I stated earlier, it still exists, and it will exist so eternally. There's prakat, there's the pastimes when Krishna is here and they're visible, and after Krishna goes back to the spiritual world, he actually remains aprakat in unmanifest pastimes. That they're happening, but you have to have the eyes covered with a salve of bhakti or devotion to see them. That Vrindavan's still here, in all its simplicity and glory and vanas, many forests, it's all there. And that Vrindavan actually, Srila Prabodhananda Saraswati describes in his famous Vrindavan Mahima Murita, such a popular book, so many verses. He gives a beautiful description of what Vrindavan still is now to those who have the eyes to see. He writes, I meditate on Vrindavan, where the cuckoos sing the 5th note, the flute plays splendid melodies, peacocks sing and dance, vines and trees bloom, splendid charming forests are wonderful with many birds and deer, and where there are many splendid lakes, streams, and hills. Shri Brajbhumi Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki. For us, that Vrindavan, apakat, Vrindavan, can only be seen and realized, actually, by the mercy of our Srila Prabhupada. We often mention that the spiritual master is the revealer of the Dham. He reveals the Dham to us through introducing us to the process of sadhana bhakti, whereby we purify our hearts of all contamination. And especially by the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra, we awaken our devotion, our love for Krishna. So in this way he reveals the Dham. The spiritual master doesn't just wave his hand and then you have the vision. Work now, samadhi later. So we're works in progress. But it's Srila Prabhupada, our founder Acharya, who came to Vrindavan, set the standard how to live here, wrote about Vrindavan, came to the West and invited us to come to Vrindavan. Even there's invitations in his books, in Chaitanya Charitamrita, Srimad Bhagavatam, to this very day, welcoming people to this transcendental abode. Therefore, in this series, we should remember him at every step of the way. As we delve into the history of the sacred land of Brajabhumi, he's the revealer of the Dham. And in that regard, there's one shloka that At least for me, it's a shloka that, how do you say it? It cries out to Srila Prabhupada from the very depths of one's heart. Hey Guru Janada Dina Bandhu Svananda Data Koro Naika Shindu Vrindavan Ashina Hita Va Tara Prashira Radha Pranaya Pachara. So beautiful. O spiritual master, O giver of divine wisdom, O friend of the fallen, you are the giver of your own bliss, and you are the only ocean of mercy. Although dwelling in Vrindavan, you have descended for the welfare of fallen souls like me, and you are preaching the divine love for Radha and Krishna. Please be kind upon me. So with Srila Prabhupada's blessings, this is history lessons we're talking now, not so many leelas, maybe not so much philosophy, but it's all transcendental because it's connected to Braj, how it came to look like it does today. So let's discuss now where all these beautiful structures that we see in the town, if you walk around Vrindavan, almost every other building has some history to it. Of course, they're knocking some of them down now, unfortunately. But still, even today, as I was wandering that day, just so many amazing structures. Where did they come from? Well, we did touch upon this in a previous lecture. You may remember how some months ago, in our series about Govindaji, we mentioned how Raj Jai Singh II from Jaipur, who welcomed Govindaji into his new city of Jaipur and built a beautiful temple for him, which is still there. Jai Singh, you may remember, would sometimes come to Braj. He was royalty. This is in the 1700s. He would come here for inspiration. Actually, I heard Prabhupada say one time in his room in Vrindavan when I was present for one of the big festivals every year in India, in Mayapur and Vrindavan. He said, very simply, he said, Vrindavan is for inspiration. Now you must go back to the West and preach Krishna consciousness, distribute my books. So it's enough just to come here for inspiration. What to speak of being so fortunate as myself and others, we got on lockdown here. The lockdown's over, but we're still locked in. We developed some attraction for this transcendental place. So, you can come here just for inspiration, which he did. He was the king. Jaipur's a 3-hour drive. It's probably a day or 2, 3 ride on horses or palanquins or whatever, but he would come here. The king would come to Vrindavan. And although he was very wealthy and powerful and famous, we heard how he would often come incognito. He didn't want to be recognized as anyone special because he knew the most famous person who has all 6 opulences is called Bhagavan. Sri Krishna came to Braj and he remained in his deity form. So he would come not as the master, but he would come as the humble servant. He'd actually come barefoot as a simple pilgrim, the king. And he'd wander around, take bath in the kunds and the lakes, roll in the dust, visit the temples, hear from the sadhus, the king. But at the same time, to honor and make Vrindavan glorious, he actually constructed a number of residences, for his family, because they would also come, and he would also come, not just as a sadhu, but he would also come and reside here with his family and participate in the festivals. So he built a number of residences next to the Keshi Ghat, actually just a few meters from Keshi Ghat, that exist to this very day. I recently visited Srivats Goswami, one of the very famous Gaudiya Vaishnava, a preeminent scholar at the present time, very wonderful devotee, Srivats Goswami. Many of you may know he's contributed in so many ways to our ISKCON movement. So at the present time, he lives in one of those palatial buildings constructed by Jai Singh II on the banks of the Jamuna River at Keshigarh. He invited me to come, and we wanted to discuss some scholarly matters. And he lives in one of the buildings, and actually there's a whole complex there that has been rejuvenated. It's been reconstructed, but much of the original buildings are there. I was walking around and thinking, oh, this is how the kings lived. How the kings lived. Now one scholar is living there, Shivatsa Goswami. So it's a beautiful, Jai Singh II made a beautiful contribution to Vrindavan. And it was built in such a way that it still stands 300 years after it was built. Now to say that many structures were built by royal families is evident by the fact that many of these temples were constructed out of red sandstone. This red sandstone was only available to the emperors in Delhi or members of royal families. No one else could even touch it. Only those, the emperor or royal families had access to that red sandstone, and they would. So you see in Vrindavan that many of these structures that were built by the royal families are of red sandstone because only they could afford it. Just like in any society, much of what is art and culture is done by the government, at least in previous ages. I know in Europe, many of the beautiful buildings, many of the music, the art, the ballet, the dance, that was all supported by the kings and the governments because the common people couldn't afford it. So you see this red sandstone, that's a sign that it was done by royalty here in Braj. Therefore, Vrindavan is often referred to as a red city, or Lal Nagri. Lal Nagri means a city of love, because in Vedic culture, red signifies love. So because there's so much red sandstone here, all these buildings constructed by the royal families, it's all red. So Lal Nagri, Vrindavan's a city of love because it's all red. It's all connected. And there's also numerous, as I was walking around, I noticed numerous havelis. Havelis are actually, they're residential homes which were made and used by the kings and their relatives when they came to Vrindavan. And these havelis are like small temples, actually. They were the homes of the royalties, but because the royalties' hearts were with Krishna, they brought their Istadevs from wherever they came from, around India, mainly North India, of course. They brought their deities and they made a home for their deities, and the people lived in the home. It's not exactly a temple, but it's a residence, very ornate residence, where the royalty lived with their deities. And that's one of the reasons we can say that there's 5,000 temples in Vrindavan. It's not like main temples, but smaller temples that are still maintained even to the present day by the descendants of those families, or if they're no longer connected, families live there and they take care of those deities. The pujaris are there to take care of those deities. But big temples and havelis, and other shrines as well. So yes, Vrindavan is attractive for every devotee, irregardless of what that devotee's profession may be. So therefore that answered my question. Where did all these ornate structures come from? They came from the hearts of the royalty who wanted to serve Krishna in that way. Now, I was reading, it's really interesting. There was one queen, a queen. Her name was Surangi Maharani. She was queen in Kashmir. Kashmir, very beautiful part of India. She was with her husband, the king. They were king and queen of Kashmir. This is going back a couple hundred years. Now, one day she was sitting on her couch, very ornate couch, in her palace in Kashmir, and she said to her maidservant, Please entertain me with a story or a song. So this was no ordinary maidservant. She was actually Vaishnavi. So this maidservant smiled and she said, "Oh, my dear queen, I will tell you a story of a cowherd boy's love with the daughter of a king." I will tell you a story of a cowherd boy's love, guess who, with the daughter of a king, guess who? Radha and Krishna. So the queen didn't know what was going on, so she laughed and she said, "Oh, that sounds interesting. Tell me in detail about that, like a story or something." So this maidservant, she started describing Krishna's Dhan Leela at Govardhan Hill in Vrindavan, where we discussed so many times, where he and his friends, they hide in the bushes there behind the rocks, and when the Radharani and the gopis come by, with their milk products to sell in the market, the boys jump out and they say, "This is our area here, my father's in charge." Krishna says, "Nanda Maharaj, we're going to tax you girls." And there's these arguments go on, sometimes there's splashing of milk products, and it's all Kali, playful Leela. So this maidservant started talking about Krishna's, one of his main places, because this Dan Kali, taxing pastime, takes place all over Vrindavan. But one of the main places is at Govardhan Hill. So this maidservant started telling this, the pastime. And it went on for some time, and the queen, she became mesmerized. Because it's Shabda Brahma, it's transcendental sound vibration, it's Leela, it's a very sweet Leela. So somehow it struck a chord in her heart, like it does for us. At one time, many of us were not devotees, but we heard we heard philosophy from Srila Prabhupada, and he shared with us these transcendental Leelas from Vrindavan or Mayapur, and our hearts became softened. We wanted to hear more and more and more and more. So the maidservant went on for some time, and her last words were, "Jahadan man ki tor." Jahadan man ki tor, meaning the place where the pastimes of Dan and Man happened, in Braj. So the queen, again, she was very touched by hearing all this, and as the days went by, she kept saying to her servant, "Tell me that story again. Tell me the story, how that boy would tax that girl." And she developed this very strong desire, to visit that place where such pastimes take place. The whole purpose of this, these series of classes on Vrindavan for almost 3 years is just to elicit this desire to come here to Braj. Because whatever you do here, the benefit is magnified 1,000 times. You chant 16 rounds, it's 16,000 rounds. Something like that. So she had this very strong desire. So she said to her servant, "Can you take me there?" So her servant said, "All right, my dear queen, I'll take you there, but it's a great distance away." It's a fact, if you look at a map, even though Vrindavan's in North India, and Kashmir's northwest, it's some distance away. What's more, the problem was that, the king is obviously not going to let his queen make this long, dangerous journey to some village in North India. He's not going to allow her to go. But she had some lolium. She had some greed. So she decided to leave secretly. And one night, she left with her servant and several pallbearers, or not pallbearers, she left with some, pallbearers, they carry the palanquin. They all left from a secret exit in the palace. And that small contingent, they didn't want to attract too much attention, although she's the queen and she's wearing her royal dress and the palanquin is somewhat royal. They tried to remain as incognito as possible. And they traveled for months, and finally they arrived in Vrindavan. And immediately, arriving in Vrindavan, this famous queen, she found some sadhus and she said, "Where's Dangati?" She knew the name. "Where is Dangati?" Now, these sadhus were a little confused because of her royal dress. Because she was not a simple village woman. So they asked her, "Who are you?" And her reply, by her reply we can understand her heart. She said, "Actually, I'm no one. I'm just a lost soul who wants to see the beautiful pastime place of Dangati. That is my only desire." The sadhus were impressed. So they directed her to the place where Krishna playfully taxed the gopis at Govardhan Hill. Now, it's written that when she arrived there, this queen got off her palanquin and started dancing in great happiness. And as she did so, her large skirt, which was, you can just imagine it was embedded with gold and fine, silk thread and jewels and so forth and so on. As she started dancing, this skirt started twirling around with such force that the gold pieces and the gems started falling off and the silk thread became unraveled, but all these gems are on the ground. And I was reading at one point her jeweled hair clips fell off, and then her necklace. And finally, she was just dancing and dancing in such happiness. I'm in Dangati. And all her jewels fell off. Now, after she stopped dancing, celebrating the fact that she'd arrived in Vrindavan at the special pastime place, this Leela Snan, to the surprise of everyone who was watching, when she stopped dancing, she didn't bother to pick up the jewels or didn't ask anyone to collect the jewels. She just walked away. And later that day, I was reading, she put on the simple white cloth of a sadhvi, a renounced lady in Braj. We call the men sadhus and the ladies who come here and live a renounced life, sadhvis. What's more, records show that she took up a very humble residence at Govardhan Hill, near to Dangati, and she would practice madhukari every day. Madhukari means that the sadhu or the sadhvi, for their sustenance, for their food, they go to 4 homes a day. 4 homes where the householders are living. And whatever the householders give them as prasad, that's what they eat. If they get nothing, they fast. That's Krishna's desire. Today I'll chant all day long. I won't eat. But generally the Vrajvasis, as I was mentioning in another lecture, they love to feed the visitors. They love to feed the sadhus. That's Braj. So she sustained herself by humbly begging, door to door, every day for madhukari. And what's really interesting, that she took up a seva, because we come to Vrindavan to serve Krishna. Jivera Supoya Krishnara Nityadas, we're servants, so we have to find some service. So what service did she take up? She took up the service of taking a broom and sweeping the Parikrama Marg around Govardhan Hill. Probably not the whole hill, but a certain portion. Every day, this queen from Kashmir, she would sweep with the broom around Govardhan Hill. And because she had renounced her royalty to become a simple sadhvi, and became a very great devotee, because she was also doing Nam Bhajan. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare. She became very famous. To turn her back on material existence and face the Lord with the only desire to please Him through seva, this takes courage. Because we've been trying to enjoy this material world since time immemorial. Brahmanda Brahmati Konya Bhagavan Jeev Guru Krishna Prasad Pai Bhakti Lata Bij. Our history is very clear. You don't have to go to a psychic or, tarot cards or whatever. We know from that verse, we've been in this material world since time immemorial. Going from one Brahmananda, one universe to the next, one species of life to the next, one body to the next. And it's the same sad story every time, but it takes time to learn. So that's a very intense desire to be the big fish. So if you could turn your back on that and face Krishna honestly and say, now from this day forth, Krishna, I am yours, that person becomes famous. Like Prabhupada, I mentioned this one time before, Prabhupada told one of my sannyasi godbrothers when he gave him sannyas, never look back and think that you've left anything valuable behind, and never envy the position of the materialistic sense enjoyers. Just look towards the divine realm of Goloka, the light, and serve Krishna to the best of your ability. So she became very famous, and she remained a simple sweeper of the marg the rest of her life. In fact, in her old age, she left her body sweeping. She just was sweeping one day and she fell over. And in Vrindavan, many times when I inquire about an old sadhu I know or a friend, I can't find him. They'll go like this. I said, what does that mean? He's gone Golok. Yeah, Golok. So she left for Golok. And when she died, because of her renunciation, because of her devotion, her bhakti, because of her seva, they placed her in samadhi. Not because she was a queen. That terminology didn't apply to her. No one knew her as the queen. They knew her as the sadhvi, the Vrajrenu of Vrindavan. So she was placed in samadhi. And they say her samadhi is out at Gokul in a very secluded place. Her samadhi. Now the interesting thing is that not only was she placed in samadhi, but she was placed in samadhi with her broom. She was placed in samadhi with her broom. And I had to research a little bit for that one. In Vrindavan in the old days, advanced sadhus were placed in samadhis with what they would say were the instruments of their service. The instruments of their service. They write that their instruments were their eternal friends. They were placed in samadhi with the instruments of their services, a broom or a pot, they were a cook or a weaver or whatever the sadhu was. The instruments of their service were their eternal friends. Because through those instruments they showed their devotion, they expressed their devotion to Krishna. I thought that was really interesting. They were placed in samadhi with the instruments of their service, their eternal friends. Also famous in this regard, because when you research, one thing leads to another thing. Also famous in this regard was the Tedi Lakut. Tedi Lakut. A stick from a Vrindavan forest. A stick from a Vrindavan forest, where the Lord had performed his pastimes. Now, Tedi Lakut literally means a crooked stick. And, you can imagine in the forest in the old days, even today, very old trees, often twisted and gnarled. So the sadhus, they would approach such a tree in the mood of thinking this is a kalpavriksha tree. And they would pray to the tree to please allow them to take a branch to use it as a support for chanting their japa. If you sit and do 192 rounds a day, maybe your arm will get tired. So in the old days they had a stick and it'd have, like this, it went like this, and you'd put your hand as you're sitting and you would chant your japa like this. So they didn't just want any stick because they're chanting Sri Nam. Kali Kali Nam Rup Krishna Avatar. The incarnation of this age is the holy name itself. So Krishna's present in his name. So respectively, everything had to be pakka. So they would take a branch from a kalpavriksha tree and it would be turned and twisted in an attractive way, and they would chant like that. Yeah. Tedi lakut, Tedi lakut. I've seen on several occasions. I've seen these stands, very old ones. In fact, I have one. One sadhu, where was it? In Orissa. He gave me his guru's Tedi lakut, and sometimes I chant not 192 rounds, but I'll chant my 16 rounds. History. And so, actually, I'd like to share that gift with all of you so you can see it with your own eyes. What is a Tedi lakut? Here it is. It's crooked, gnarled, and it's from a Kalpavriksha tree, and it's given to me by that sadhu. It was his guru's. And I've many times said, Prabhupada told me personally, he said a gift from a sadhu is a very precious thing, a very special thing. So they would, I've got room here, they chant, they put like this and they chant their japa. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama. A Tedi lakut. When would you ever get to see a Tedi lakut? Hare Krishna. There we go. When such sadhus passed away, their Tedi lakuts were also placed in samadhi with them. Hare Krishna. Such culture. Vrindavan Dham ki jai. Now we understand why we hear in Vrindavan Mahimamrita by Prabhupada Saraswati, we should run to Braj. We should just run here. At least we should come here as often as history allows us. I think now that the world's sort of opening up in some ways, closing in others, but opening in other ways, many of you will be able to come here for the next Kartik. And we're going to have a nice Kartik Purikama. You can join us if you want. And how exciting that will be, for many of you to be back here in Braj. After hopefully hearing so many of the glories of Vrindavan and reading about it in Prabhupada's books and etc. So that, can't wait for you to all come. And if you can't come, we can run to Vrindavan in our hearts, because Vrindavan is also a question of consciousness. If you have that Vrindavan consciousness, you can live in Vrindavan wherever you are, as Advaitacharya famously said to Lord Chaitanya, who was attempting to go to Vrindavan, but they weren't allowing him to go. He said, Lord, wherever you are, that is Vrindavan. So we can make our home Vrindavan as well. So thank you so much. These are just a few of the interesting episodes and curiosities of historic Vrindavan that I discovered just by skimming the surface of some of these historical books. And I hope that such discussions awaken a strong desire in your heart to come here when the opportunity arises. I hope that that's the result. And in that vein, I will finish with a quote from Sri Narahari Chakravarti Thakur's Bhakti Ratnakara. So nice. Shall I, a worthless person, ever again see the deities of Govinda, Gopinath, Madan Mohan, Radha Vinod, Radha Mohan, and Radha Damodar? Will Prabhu Shri Gopal Bhatta ever bring me back to Vrindavan and give me the opportunity to serve his lotus feet again? Shall Lokanath Goswami, the incarnation of kindness, bestow his grace upon me again? Catching hold of the hair of this sinner, will the gracious Bhugarbha Goswami ever bring me back here to Vrindavan again? Will Raghunath Das Goswami, the embodiment of kindness, ever again fulfill my desires to go to Vrindavan? Srila Jiva Goswami is the light of the poor and the unfortunate people. Will I ever see his feet again? O associates of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, will you ever bring such an unfortunate soul as me to Vrindavan and allow me to enjoy your company? Let's have this mood, keep this mood, and achieve eternal Braj. Thank you so much, Prabhu. See you in a couple of days with more history. Shishi Gauranitai ki, Shishi Krishna Balaram ki, Shishi Radha Shama Sundar ki, Vrindavaneshwari Shrimati Radharani ki, Mayapur Dham ki, Shishi Gauranitai ki, Hare Krishna Maha Mantra ki, Shri Krishna Sankirtan Yajna ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Nitai Gaur Premanandi, Jai Jai Sri Sri Radhe Sham. All glories to the devotees. Hare Krishna.